God, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining me. I've been following you for a long time, specifically on Twitter, and I'm really honored to be able to have this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Ryan. Cheers.
I've been listening. I've seen your book, but admittedly, I've just been listening to it over the past couple of weeks now, and it just surmises perfectly what I think is happening in society, which is a real travesty. And I don't really know how we got to this point. I mean, you talk about this concept of death by 1,000 cuts. I'm wondering if just gradually over time, we've got ourselves into the position that we are societally.
Yeah, so I think a good analogy is to say when you talk about comorbidities, in terms of the health is patient's health. If they're overweight, it's bad. If they're overweight and they have a family history of heart disease, it's worse. If they're overweight, they have family of heart disease, and they're diabetic, it's even worse. And so that's really the analogy with the death of 1,000 cuts. One of these idea pathogens may not be sufficiently virulent enough to bring down the edifices of reason that we've erected in the West. But when you put a whole bunch of these dreadful parasitic ideas together into a cocktail, then it becomes difficult to navigate through reality. And so up is down, left is right, wrong is right. And so certainly I'm guessing at some point we'll talk about some of these specific idea pathogens.
Yeah, I hope so. I'd like to get into that, but it leads me to think that if all of these, and maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but let's just hit on this, is that if all of these strange ideologies, to put it mildly, were introduced all at once, I think it would be repulsive and rejected by much of society. But it seems to be that they're introduced gradually and slowly over time. And once one idiotic idea is accepted, then a new one is introduced that we'll become comfortable with at some point.
Yeah, and so that's why I use the parable of the boiling frog, right? The idea, of course,
Right.
which some scientific experiments have refuted the idea, but the parable still holds, which is that if you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, immediately, then it will try to jump out. But if you put it in, lukewarm water and slowly increase the temperature so that it is below a just noticeable difference, then with each increment, the frog doesn't pick up the sensorial difference, and then eventually it boils to death. And so that's exactly what's happening with these dreadful ideas. As you said, one of them might get under our radar, two of them, three of them, but then once you put them all together, it really becomes a problem. Now, I don't mean to imply, by the way, or I don't want your audience to think that this is a, conspiratorial, concerted effort by nefarious folks to put all of these ideas. Each of these ideas or idea pathogens arose for a different reason, but what they all share in common is a original goal to solve some noble cause. But then in the pursuit of that noble cause, the idea metamorphosizes into BS, right? So in the pursuit of a social justice goal, you end up killing the truth as a collateral. And of course, I argue in the book repeatedly that when it comes to the defense of truth with a capital T, we should be deontological. Deontological means that there are absolute truths that we never waver from for consequentialist reasons, right? So if your spouse asks you, do I look fat in those jeans? Then if you want to have a long, successful marriage, then you want to put on your consequentialist hat, which basically says, if I have to lie to spare my spouse's feelings, then that's okay to do. The consequences justify the lie. But when it comes to truth with a capital T, we never sacrifice a millimeter of truth for some quote noble goal. And so that's where I think all of these dreadful ideas, all of which, by the way, were spawned within the university ecosystem. As I always remind people, as George Orwell remarked many years ago, it takes intellectuals to come up with some of the dumbest ideas.
Let's go back to that remark you made about your wife and jeans. So this is actually something I've had a conversation about, and I think there's a broader implication here. You said that maybe you'll spare the truth to spare her feelings. I actually disagree with that. I think that you should tell her the truth. Now, there's a tactful and appropriate way to do it, but if you don't tell her the truth, you're undermining your own authority, credibility, influence with her. And it seems to me that truth is important, even if it does maybe sting a little bit in this example, just in life in general.
Sure. Well, look, I guess we can certainly debate where that line of consequentialism should fall. But for many things in life, it would be too rigid for us to assume a deontological bent, right? Because for some things, it really is a gray area. So the classic example, if you have some Jews that are hidden in your, cellar, and the Nazis come in and say, "Be truthful. Are there any Jews that you're hiding here?" So what do? Do you take a deontological bent, or do you take a consequentialist one? So we can all debate as to where that line should be, but we can certainly all agree that in many cases, it is difficult to pursue a deontological bent because life is made up of gray shades. But truth, right? And certainly I'm in the business of generating knowledge and disseminating knowledge. And if I am an honest scientist, I never equivocate on the truth for political reasons, to spare someone's hurt feelings. But what we're seeing today, what I call progressive epistemology, epistemology is philosophy of knowledge, right? So under progressive woke epistemology, if you do a scientific study and the results come out in line with a politically correct position, then publish it and you'll be hailed as a hero. If they don't come out the way it should be according to PC orthodoxy, then you suppress it. If you publish it, then you are akin to Himmler and Hitler. Well, science doesn't get adjudicated based on political ideologies. I'll give you a very quick, explicit example, if I may. So when I talk, so I'm an evolutionary psychologist and consumer psychologist. So whenever I'm lecturing, say on sexual variety, right, variety seeking, the fact that we've both evolved to be polygynous, to have desire for many people, but also to form long-term monogamous unions, and therein lies the tension for most people, right? And so if I offer some evolutionary reasons why women also seek sexual variety, as they do, then I will get the feminists who will write to me and say, "Dr. Saad, you're such a brilliant scientist," because that message resonates with their political ideology. If in the next sentence I say, "Notwithstanding that both sexes might seek sexual variety, men have greater penchant for sexual variety," the same feminists will write to me and say, "Dear Dr. Himmler, you are a sexist patriarchal pig." So from this side of the mouth, I was a brilliant scientist. From that side of the same mouth, I became Hitler, because depending on what I said, either agreed with your ideology or not. Science doesn't operate that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that we've placed the feelings of others and how people perceive things and how they might feel offense above the truth, like you said, with a capital T, because I think this leads to all sorts of problems in society where, we make martyrs out of those who speak the truth. We crucify them, we ostracize them. In many cases, they get doxxed, and then it continues to evolve into this slow loss of what is true and what is not, and reality is lost.
Yeah, exactly. Look, in 2002, maybe this is a good segue to maybe give an example of a specific idea pathogen, although we can certainly discuss many of them from the book. I call postmodernism the granddaddy of all idea pathogens, because it is the highest form of intellectual terrorism, because it basically purports that there are no objective truths, right? Other than the one truth that there are no objective truths. So already the whole house of cards is breaking apart. So postmodernism is a perfectly anti-scientific framework, because, of course, scientists do wake up every day thinking that there are truths out there to be discovered. Now, science recognizes that truths are provisional. What we thought was true in science 300 years ago may no longer be true today. So we have epistemic humility. We are willing to change our views as a function of incoming new evidence that might falsify our previously held positions. But we do think that there are truths. We do know that men are taller than women. Even though there are many women that are taller than men, on average, men are taller than women. So let me give you an example. So the reason why postmodernism is an idea pathogen is because it is literally the eradication of the epistemology of truth. The scientific method is an incredibly powerful framework for us to be able to adjudicate that which is true versus that which is not true. Postmodernism says, you're wasting your time. There is no truth. What's the point of the scientific method? Everything is subjective. Everything is shackled by our personal biases. bullshit, if I may say. Of course not. If you jump out of the Empire State Building 100 times, I could 100 times predict what will be the outcome of your head when you land on the pavement. Gravity is not a social construct. So in 2002, I had one of my doctoral students had just defended his PhD dissertation, and so we were going out to a celebratory dinner. It was myself, him, my wife, and he brought a date along. I recount this story in the Parasitic Mind. And so he calls me before the dinner meeting to kind of give me a heads up that the date that he's bringing along is a graduate student in postmodernism, cultural anthropology, and women's study. To which I answered, aha, the holy trinity of bullshit. And so his point was, of course, that, you know, let's have a nice evening and so on. I said, oh, I got you, no problem. I'll be on my best behavior, which of course was a lie. And so about halfway through the evening, I turned to the lady in question. I said, oh, I hear you're a postmodernist. Yes. Do you mind if I propose what I think are certain universals? And then you can correct me as to how they're not universals, because I do believe that they are human universals, but you think that there are no objective truths, so on. She goes, yes, go for it. Is it not universally true that within Homo sapiens, only women bear children? So look here, by the way, Ryan, I prophetically, came before the whole transgender men can get pregnant. This was in 2002, almost 20 years ago.
Wow,
so I said, so is it not true that only women bear children? So she looks at me with complete disdain, with derision. She can't believe that someone could be such a simpleton like yours truly. She says, no, of course it's not true. I said, oh, it's not true. How is that? She said, well, there is some Japanese tribe off some Japanese island whereby within their mythological folkloric realm, it is the men who bear children. So by you maintaining the conversation to the biological realm, that's how you keep us, barefoot and pregnant. So once I recovered from the mini stroke due to her imbecility, I then said, okay, well, let me come up with another example that might be a bit less corrosive and controversial as women bear children. She said, yeah, go for it. Is it not true that from any vantage point on Earth, sailors since time immemorial have relied on the premise that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and have used that for their navigation? There she used something from Jacques Derrida, deconstructionism, language creates reality. She said, well, what do you mean by east and west? And what do you mean by the sun? That which you call the sun, I might call dancing hyena. Literally, those are her words. I said, well, fine, the dancing hyena rises.
Then call it with that, right?
And then she said, I don't play those label games. So when I couldn't find an intersection of meaning in the Venn diagram between me and this person, she's a graduate student, right? She's not an escapee from a mental asylum, although one could argue that studying postmodernism is the same as being in a mental asylum. So if we can't agree on the basics of women bear children, and there is east, there is west, and there's the sun, then where does that lead you? It's an epistemological dead end. So now imagine if you have 40, 50 years of students being inculcated with this garbage. They can't build bridges. There are no postmodernist bridges. You can't build planes. You can't cure cancer. You can't solve number theory problems in mathematics. You can't build a mathematical model to understand consumer choice using postmodernism. So it's a form of intellectual terrorism that, number one, parasitizes the minds of those who study it, and number two, steals their parents' hard-earned money to pay for their tuition.
What is the point? If you were to ask, for example, a postmodernist, what is the point, or what is the objective, or why would you even believe in this way of viewing the world? I think it's easy to say, well, we believe in objective truth because that helps us formulate better conclusions to live our lives more effectively. But what would a postmodernist say about their perception of the world?
Yeah, so to answer that question, I'll first answer it broadly, and then we can bring it back to postmodernism. As I was trying to look at all of the idea pathogens that I cover in the book, so postmodernism, militant feminism, biophobia, the fear of using biology to explain human behavior, cultural relativism, identity politics, victimology, all of these different strains of idea pathogens, I wanted to look at they're all different. They've all evolved for different reasons. Their trajectories are different, but do they have anything in common? And that's going to get at the root of your question. So in the same way that cancer, pancreatic cancer is different than leukemia, which is different from melanoma, they do share one thing in common, which is they all involve the unchecked cell division. So at least we have that as common ground across all the different cancers, which are otherwise very different. So when it comes to idea pathogens, what I argued is that they all free us from the pesky shackles of reality, right? So for example, trans, I just put the word trans, and suddenly I can be an elderly Korean woman. So I explained in the book that I wanted to participate in the under 9, meaning less than 9-year-old judo championships for kids who are less than 70 pounds. That's absolutely no problem epistemologically. I use transgravity, which allows me to self-identify. At the time I was close to 200 pounds. It allows me to self-identify as less than 70 pounds. And I use trans-ageism, which doesn't shackle me to my actual age. It's what I self-identify that matters. Now, it's very important here to recognize that me saying this in no way, only imbeciles who are lobotomized think that I'm making fun of trans people. I'm not, because gender dysphoria does exist. People who are transgender deserve to live with the full dignity and free of bigotry, just like anybody else. That doesn't mean, though, that in the service of protecting trans people from bigotry, we murder truth, to go to my earlier point, right? So no, you can't be transracial. No, you can't be trans thin. But it can liberate me from the shackles of my genitalia. So postmodernism liberates me from truth. There is no truth. There is my truth. There is my lived experience, right? And so if you look at each of those idea pathogens, they all serve one ultimate goal, which is the freeing of whomever is engaging in this idea pathogen from the pesky shackles of reality. I'll give you one other quick example. Social constructivism is another idea pathogen. Social constructivism basically argues that everything is due to a social construction. For example, sex differences, there are no innate sex differences. It's only because mama and papa taught Joe to play rough.
Trained, sure.
Trained, exactly. There are no biological imperatives that can explain sexual dimorphisms across the two sexes. Well, that's a very liberating message, because what that also teaches me is that we are all born tabula rasa, empty slates, with equal potentiality, right? Well, that's very hopeful. I'd like to believe that my child, the only reason why he didn't become Michael Jordan is not because there is any innate starting point that made my child less likely to be the next Michael Jordan. It's only because I didn't hug him enough, or hugged him too much, or I gave him too many Big Macs, or not enough Big Macs, that led to Michael Jordan being able to jump much higher than my kid. So again, by adopting the ethos of social constructivism, it frees me from the shackles of reality. My son could truly be the next Lionel Messi. That's a wonderful message, completely rooted in bullshit, but it still makes me feel really good.
As you were writing that, I started to think about, when children, for example, and I have 4 kids of my own, say, well, that isn't fair. And the parent's appropriate response is, well, life isn't always fair. That's the deal. Welcome to life. It seems to me that these kids grew up saying life isn't fair, and nobody told them, well, life isn't fair. We don't start at an equal place. We don't all have the same genes or biological makeup or predisposition to be competitive or passive. Like, everybody's different. But I started thinking about this with sexes, for example. It's a real shame, just to look at it in this context, that somebody who's a woman, for example, considers herself inferior and feels like she needs to free herself from the shackles of being a woman. I look at my wife, and she honors her femininity. She honors the fact that she's a woman. She doesn't look at it as bondage or slavery or beholden to me or anything else. She loves being a woman. I don't understand why these are constraints to some people.
Well, look, it's astonishing that for a sexually reproducing species that has 2 phenotypes called male and female, that we need to have these types of conversations. I had to appear in front of the Canadian Senate in 2017 to testify about, well, I mean, the general theme was Bill C-16, which was a bill that was seeking to introduce gender identity and gender expression under the rubric of hate crimes. And of course, my position, and some of your viewers might also know that Jordan Peterson was also part of the the witnesses at that thing. Neither of our position was, we support bigotry against transgender people, or that we don't want them to live free of bigotry. But we recognize that there were, the proverbial slippery slope is something that we really need to discuss. So for example, if I'm sitting in my evolutionary psychology course and I want to talk about Darwin's sexual selection, which talks about two sexes, is that now transphobic? Well, as I was making those arguments, very sober arguments in front of, a bunch of truly laughable, idiotic, lobotomized, self-indulgent imbeciles who were mocking and scoffing, all of whom are now eating their words, I couldn't believe the political theater that was taking place, right? Because it was like, oh, what a conspiratorial freak this idiot is in reference to me. No one's ever going to stop you from teaching this or saying that. But now we know that different places, hospitals are asking people to incorporate, not ask, demand that you put he, him, or they, whatever in your signature. They had said that they'd never be compelled speech. Now, of course, some people say, well, what's the big deal? What's the big deal if you just put that in your... But here there's a deontological principle. The deontological principle is, it's not for Big Daddy, meaning the government, to compel me to say or take any position that I don't wish to take, right? I mean, that's, I'm an evolutionist, yet I recognize that there are religious people who wish to teach their kids at Sunday school that evolution is a Zionist hoax. And in a free society, idiots are allowed to exist. I'm a Jewish person. I'm a Lebanese Jew who escaped execution in Lebanon, yet I support the right of Holocaust deniers to deny the most grotesque, reality in history that is the most documented event in human history. Yet I recognize that in a free society, my feelings might be hurt in the most grotesque way, which is the denial of the eradication of my people, right? So in a free society, shit happens. And therefore, you don't compel me to say him, hey, he, and you don't compel me. And that's the bottom line. But yet people are driven by an ethos of empathy. Therefore, don't have closed borders, because that's simply not empathetic to Guatemalans, right? Don't fight against the gender pronoun issue, because why? Are you a mean person who hates transgender people? So it's a type of kindergarten logic that's driven by empathy, right? Well, I'm about as empathetic as they come, but I'm also rooted in reality. So these two things should not be pitted against each other. I could chew gum and walk at the same time.
Well, and it's also a very closed-minded level of empathy. You talk about open borders, for example. Somebody who says, well, there should be no borders because that's not very kind to people who would like to come to this country, for example. Well, okay, well, how does that factor for all of those immigrants who came here legally? How does that factor for the negative consequences that come from opening up borders and not knowing who people are? How does that factor for a mother and father who lose their daughter to somebody who came here illegally and decided to rape that daughter or murder that daughter? It's maybe empathetic, but it's not a complete picture of empathy. It's a very isolated, closed-minded view of empathy.
Well, and look, I think Thomas Sowell said it, but many others have remarked, myself included, that, I mean, life is about trade-offs, right? So there is no way by which you're going to maximize a single objective function, which is, minimize the hurt of noble immigrants who come undocumented, because life involves trade-offs. In an ideal world, I'd like to think that there's no possibility that a homeless person is going to go through the streets of Montreal in the cold winter of Montreal. Yet, notwithstanding that that's a dreadful reality, I recognize that I can't keep my front door open because, it would otherwise be unfair to homeless people who would want to come into my house and sleep there. I mean, I help the homeless people by paying the totality of about 65% of my income ends up going to the government. Yeah, that's a real number. Okay, that's a real number. From January till about end of August, I work for free. So I'm about 65% of a complete slave. And only in August, I am allowed by my noble overlords to keep some of the money of my own. So I already exhibit tons of empathy to all sorts of people with the hundreds of thousands of dollars that I pay per year in taxes. So again, it's a form of truly stunted childhood logic to view the world through the lens of, this orgiastic empathy. This is precisely why, Ryan, in chapter 2 of The Parasitic Mind, I talk about the distinction between feeling versus thinking. And the reason why that's a very important distinction, number one, is because it's a wrong dichotomy to set up. It's not that we are a reasoning animal or a feeling animal. We're both. The challenge is to know when to trigger or activate which system. When I am going down a dark alley because I want to take a shortcut to get home, and I see 4 young men loitering, and by the way, I said 4 young men, not 4 elderly nuns, because I recognize that statistically speaking, young men are more likely to be violent than elderly nuns. And that doesn't make me ageist or sexist. It makes me somebody who has a brain who can calculate statistical regularities. But progressives think that that would have been ageist and sexist. But in any case, when
it just depends on what color they are. Because if they're white men, that's not a problem. If it was any other race, then maybe it would be a problem.
Exactly, because it's only neo-Nazi skinheads who are dangerous. There are no other types of young men who otherwise might cause me harm. There's just no documented cases of anybody other than young white men committing crimes. Just follow the data. Okay,
that's right.
Right. So anyways, so when I walk down that dark alley, what happens? My heart starts racing, my blood pressure goes up. So I am having an affective-based response, a feeling response that makes perfect evolutionary sense. On the other hand, if I'm trying to do well on a calculus exam, you can trigger my affective system all you want. If I haven't studied for the exam, if I don't activate my cognitive system, I'm not going to do well on the calculus exam. So again, the problem is when we are misactivating, we're misfiring the incorrect mechanism for the wrong situation. So if we apply it to, say, the political world, so I saw all of my super smart, super highfalutin progressive colleagues, all of whom in unison said that Donald Trump, this is not hyperbolic now, this is not my sarcasm, this is literally the case, was going to usher a nuclear holocaust. Democracy was going to end. Martial law was going to be instituted. The economy was going to be obliterated. We were going to go back to a barter system where I trade you a caught fish for the fig leaf that is covering your genitalia. That's what he was going to do, right? Now, how could it be that otherwise supposedly intelligent intellectual colleagues could be so unhinged, so deranged? Well, as I explain in the book, it's because they were fully immersed in activating their emotional system. Donald Trump disgusts me. He is grotesque. I revile him. Every single statement that I make regarding Donald Trump, I'm saying this now as the progressive professor, not me,
sure.
Is a utterance of my affective position. I didn't say I dislike Donald Trump because I disagree with his monetary policy because of reason X, Y, Z. He disgusts me. He speaks in a vulgar way. He puts out disgusting tweets. On the other hand, noble prophet Barack Obama is just music to my ears. So let me give you an example here from Arabic. Arabic is my mother tongue. Presume that this for a second is the cork of a wine bottle. Okay, Ryan? There's an expression in Arabic that says, getting drunk simply by smelling the cork of the wine bottle. What does that mean? It basically means that I am such a lightweight that I don't actually need to go through the effort of drinking the wine bottle to get drunk. I just take a whiff and I'm already drunk. So therefore, when I now smell Barack Obama, oh my God, he has such a mellifluous voice. He has such a radiant smile. He's so tall and lanky. He's so charming. Therefore, what he says must be true. Now, the reality is that every single syllable that he's ever uttered is a platitudinal sack of shit. But that doesn't matter. I'm drunk by his magisterial nature. On the other hand, fat boy Trump disgusts me. Therefore, every single position that I've taken, I'm speaking now as super smart, progressive professor, every position that I take is rooted in the affective reasons why I hate Trump and the affective reasons why I love Kamala Harris, right? But paradoxically, it might turn out that actually my positions are a lot more aligned with Donald Trump, as I know many of my colleagues are, but they never look that far because that part of their brain has been shut off. Trump is disgusting. And so it's a bewildering reality, right? Because you would think that when you are trained, just like a soccer player is trained to be super fit, you would think that an intellectual who spent their entire life being trained on how to think would not succumb to these. But as I explained in the Parasitic Mind, it's professors who come up with these parasitic ideas. They are the ones who promulgate them, and they're the ones who are parasitized by them. Holy trinity of parasites.
Is there an evolutionary benefit, though, to taking that into consideration? Let's take Trump. Well, even a better example is you're walking down the road or down that alley, like you were talking about earlier, and you see somebody and it feels off, right? There's something that you can't quite put your finger on. Either that person gives you a weird vibe, or you just don't quite feel right, and you can't fully articulate or explain, but you make a decision based on that assumption or that feeling. And I assume that we've evolved to take these subtle cues into consideration to keep ourselves alive. So it seems to me that appearance with Obama, appearance with Trump, the way they present themselves is something that maybe we should listen to some degree.
Yeah, no, great question. As a matter of fact, I published a scientific paper back in 2003 in a journal, not journal, in an edited book. The paper was on evolution as applied to political marketing. And I precisely make the point that you just made, which is that it is perfectly evolutionarily feasible that we use certain, so the fancy term would be peripheral cues. So for example, how tall you are, right? So we know that yesterday I was watching The Five. Oh my God, I just admitted that I was watching Fox News. There goes my academic career. Please edit this out. No, of course I'm
if
joking.
it was going to be gone, it would have been gone by now already.
Exactly. So I was watching The Five, and Jesse, I can't remember his last name, but one of the anchors, Jesse, said regarding Buttigieg, he said, he's never going to be president. He's too short. Okay. Well, in that chapter from 2003, I talk about, for example, morphological features of presidential candidates, their height. So many of these cues that technically speaking they say nothing about their policy positions by definition,
Sure.
Yet we still use them because we want to have someone that looks as though they are intimidating and so on. So I'm not suggesting that peripheral cues are not important, but they should constitute one of many attributes that you look at, right? So for example, I could have as one attribute presidential looking, and therefore I could give Obama on a score of 10 a 9, and I could give Trump a 2. So I have incorporated what you just said, but it can't be the only one. It can't, right? What about monetary policy? What about, right? The world is typically made up of multi-attribute choices, right? Now, there are cases where we only use a single attribute to make a decision. That's called the lexicographic rule. And I actually use that psychological rule to explain why many perfectly rational people could have voted for Trump. I famously explained this to arguably the most unhinged Trump derangement syndrome person, Sam Harris, also known as the Malibu meditator. So Sam Harris, who used to be a good friend of mine, I mean, good friend, we knew each other, we've had dinner, I went on a show, became, completely, utterly lost his mind with Trump in ways that are very, very difficult to even, stomach. It's impossible to imagine someone could be that unhinged. Well, I explained to him on the show that the lexical works as follows. Let's suppose I'm choosing between toothpastes. Well, there are 15 different attributes that I can use in making a choice for toothpaste, but most people use the lexicographic rule. What does that mean? I look at my most important attribute and I simply choose the alternative that scores the highest on my most important attribute. So for example, for toothpaste, for me, it might simply be the price of the toothpaste. I don't care about tartar, is that how you say it? Tartar removal, or if it gives me,
Sure.
I just care about the price of the toothpaste. The one that's cheapest is the one that I'll buy. Well, let's apply the lexicographic rule now to Trump versus, say, Clinton when in 2016. Let's suppose that the border issue is my lexicographic attribute, meaning I'm a single issues guy. I only care about who is best in protecting our national borders. Now, it could well be that on every other attribute, let's say there are 25 attributes on which I could look at Trump versus Clinton. On the other 24, Clinton wins. But the most important attribute is the one, for me, border protection. And if Trump scores higher on it, I will choose Trump. So they are perfectly rational, well-known, well-documented, scientifically validated cognitive processes that we know consumers, in this case, voters, will use in arriving at a choice. So notwithstanding that I was very patient in explaining to the Malibu meditator how perfectly rational people could arrive at choosing Trump, and they don't have to have slept with their sisters and be called Roscoe and have a KKK hooded white robe on, that didn't seem to assuage his fear that Trump was going to outlaw sex and was going to usher nuclear holocaust. That upsets me because, for better or worse, I have the disposition to be allergic, existentially allergic to bullshit, to posturing, to inauthenticity. That's why, by the way, I like Trump, because even though a lot of his authentic qualities were annoying, at least he was authentic. I prefer an authentic, bull than an inauthentic, viper, right? So for all of these reasons, I fully agree with you that peripheral cues are important, but they can't be the only reason in terms of how I choose my president.
Right. That makes sense. I think there's another factor at play here too, that people will maybe not consciously choose based on the factor that's most important to them, but they may just rely upon somebody they admire or respect, or has some sort of credibility or authority with them, and choose just based on what that individual may choose.
Exactly.
Is this part of the way that these parasitic ideas spread, is just because so many people believe it, so it must be true?
Yeah, so that's called in psychology or marketing, it's called social proofing, right? So for example,
Right.
when McDonald's says 6 billion satisfied customers, what are they saying? Look, there has been an interaction, a service interaction with 6 billion people, and they've all already ticked it off as good. Shouldn't you also join that band of satisfied customers? So,
well, it's just funny because, take McDonald's, 6 billion satisfied customers, but you go buy a burger, you're still going to shit your pants. So it's like, but you don't, but still that 6 billion is so compelling versus your own personal experience with it.
Yeah, there's actually some interesting research that was conducted a few years ago, contrasting social proofing appeal, so the one that we just discussed, versus a scarcity appeal. A scarcity appeal would be, a limited edition, only 7 left, so on. And
right.
what these researchers did is that they were actually coming from an evolutionary perspective. Other than the work that I have generated over the past 20 years, I, if I may say, I pioneered the use of evolutionary psychology in the study of consumer behavior. But subsequently, there were several new generations of people who were originally trained in evolutionary psychology that then went on to the business school. These guys were part of that group. What they did is that they primed participants to either be in a mating mindset or in a survival mindset. And what they showed is that when you prime people to be in a mating mindset, then the scarcity appeal is more effective. Because when you are priming me to be in the mating mindset, I don't want to be part of the herd. I want to stand out, right? I want to be uniquely positioned in the mating market. I want you to notice me. On the other hand, when you prime me about to be in a survival mindset, then I want to blend into the herd. So the social proof appeal works better. I thought that was a brilliant study because it shows you that, like most things in life, and certainly like most things in psychology of advertising, There is no definitive rule. It depends. So the two appeals either work better or work less well, depending on the mindset that I come in to watching these ads.
How do you sift through the societal noise, through the media? Because I know, for example, and you've talked about this, you talked about it in the book, is truth and freedom being some of your core driving principles. But how do you sift through all the noise? And there's things that I hear that sound right. They sound true. They sound accurate. And then you delve into it and you realize, no, that isn't true. How do you sift through all of the information that we have available?
Yeah, so this we're gonna fast forward to chapter 7, where the chapter is on how to seek truth. And I basically argue that, well, first, why is it so difficult? So to your point, to obtain truth is precisely because most people are cognitive misers, meaning that they are intellectually lazy, right? So if Barack Obama tells me that Islam is a religion of peace, that's good enough for me. If George Bush tells me that Islam is a religion of peace, that's good enough for me. Just like you mentioned earlier, if I trust someone and they say something, then I buy into it. But of course, if you want to take up a epistemologically valid position on an issue, you have to do the heavy lifting. And so what I argue in chapter 7 is that there is such an epistemological tool. It is cognitively burdensome to do because you have to spend the effort to achieve truth or to get to the truth. Here's how it works. I'm going to try to amass as much evidence stemming from as many distinct lines of evidence that support my position. Okay, so example. I want to prove to you, Ryan, that toy preferences have a sex specificity. Boys prefer certain toys, girls prefer certain toys, and it's not due to social construction, right? In other words, it's not because mommy and daddy taught me to play with the truck or the doll. There are biological driven universals that shape those toy preferences. How would I go about doing that? Well, I can get you data from developmental psychology when you study young infants who are too young to have been socialized. By definition, they are at the cognitive developmental stage where they can't be socialized. And I can show you that they already exhibit that sex specificity of toy preferences. So if I had stopped right there, I've already dealt a death blow to the social constructivist argument, but I'm not going to stop there. That's why I said it takes heavy lifting. So now I got you data from developmental psychology. Now I'm going to get you data from comparative psychology, comparative in the sense that you're comparing across species. I'm going to show you data from vervet monkeys, from rhesus monkeys, and from chimpanzees that they exhibit the same sex specificity of toy preferences. It's starting to look pretty bad for you with your social constructivist bullshit, but I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to drown you with a tsunami of evidence. I'm going to get you data cross-culturally from cultures that are very, very different from the Western tradition, nomadic cultures in sub-Saharan desert where they exhibit the same sex specificity. That's not good enough for you. I'm going to get you data from 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece where researchers had done a content analysis on the outside of funerary monuments where little boys and little girls are depicting playing with the exact same toys as we see today. I'll just do one more, although the network is actually much larger than this. I can get you data from pediatric endocrinology, whereby little girls who suffer from a disease called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. This is an endocrinological disorder that masculinizes the morphology and the behaviors of little girls. Well, little girls who suffer from this disorder, drum roll, have preferences, toy preferences that are akin to those of boys. So look where I got you the data from. I got you developmental psychology data. I got you comparative psychology data. I got you cross-cultural data. I got you intertemporal data going back 2,500 years ago. I got you data from medicine, from pediatrics, all of which point to the same conclusion. Therefore, when I walk into a room of very hostile buffoons armed with that nomological network, I walk with the swagger of someone who knows what they're talking about. You better not attack me and miss, because then I'm going to destroy you. I mean, in a debate sense.
Sure.
On the other hand, So that's how you get at the truth, Brian. On the other hand, when I haven't built the requisite nomological network, then I walk with someone with due deference and humility, because I know what I know and I know what I don't know. So if you tell me, oh, hey, you live in Canada, Justin Trudeau was one of the first leaders to legalize marijuana in Canada. So what are the pros and cons of having done so? Then my answer is going to be, I simply don't know enough about this issue to offer you an intelligent, well-reasoned position. So there is no magic recipe. There is no shortcut. If you want to get to the truth, it requires effort, but at least you know that when you do your homework by building this nomological network of cumulative evidence, it becomes a lot more difficult for people to hurl hysterical insults and attacks at you. And that's what people say, how is it that you walk around, you speak your mind in this unbelievable, there's zero filter to you. You don't, I mean, I never go out of my way to hurt someone, but when it comes to taking positions, I truly am a honey badger, because I know what I'm talking about. Now, by the way, even when I know what I'm talking about, if you come with compelling arguments that causes me to have to revise my position, I'm going to say to you, well played, Brian. I need to go back to the drawing board. So I always leave room for the possibility of revising my opinion in light of incoming information. That's what ideologues don't do. Those ideologues could be Islamic terrorists. Those ideologues could be blue-haired woke Taliban. They are different. They wear different hoods, but they are made of the same mindset. There is no amount of evidence that can alter their position. That's why they operate in a religious world, right? Where you have revealed truths, right? Boys can menstruate. Shut up and go home, Rube. There is no evidence that suggests that it, right? I mean, listen, by the way, I get grown-ups, adults who write to me to show you how parasitic these ideas are. They write to me, dear Dr. Saad, I have an awkward question to ask you. So what is now the biologically accepted thing? I mean, is it women who menstruate, or do boys menstruate? I mean, imagine the world that we live in, where a functioning adult no longer feels sufficiently confident to answer that question from their lived experience. They need to get the imprimatur of the fancy professor to tell them, no, it's still true. Boys can't menstruate. It's insane.
Well, I do appreciate what you said earlier about not setting out to offend anybody. But one of the things that you actually mentioned in the book is a willingness to be able to do that, right? Is that isn't your intent or your desired objective, but at least you're willing to risk somebody being offended to share what you know to be true based on the research and the data and the information that you've collected.
Absolutely, right? So look, as I said earlier, when it comes to the truth, you have to put on your deontological hat. You never equivocate on the truth to spare someone's feelings. This is why, by the way, I've often been asked, is there any place where you think scientists should not go to study something, what is now known in science as forbidden knowledge? Just that term should give you a tingly feeling in the back of your
of course
neck. Right? What the hell do you mean forbidden knowledge? So wait a second. Physics led to the creation of the atomic bombs. Those atomic bombs were dropped on two cities that incinerated instantaneously hundreds of thousands of people and led to future misery to many others that didn't perish during the original bombing. Should we get rid of physics because there are really nasty downstream consequences of physics? You can't build cannons without understanding projectile motion. That's physics, that's mechanics. Let's get rid of it, right? By the way, that's where a lot of the idea pathogens originate. So let me give you another example of an idea pathogen that comes from that desire to create forbidden knowledge or protect against the possibility of forbidden knowledge. Cultural relativism is the idea that there are no universals. Every culture, it has to be studied and judged within its own idiosyncratic reality. So, who are we to judge that some cultures cut off the clitorises of little 5-year-old girls? I mean, that's their religious tradition. Who are we to judge, right? No, there is no context where cutting off the clitorises of little girls who haven't given you the consent to cut off their organ that will lead to sexual function is an okay thing. But under cultural relativism, that's okay. Now, where does that come from? It speaks to an earlier question you asked me about, but why do postmodernists believe this? What could be the logic of believing this? Well, it turns out that many Darwinists, many Cretans had misappropriated Darwinism to advance their political goals. So, for example, British class elitists in the 19th century wanted to argue, hey, we are the upper class. There's a Darwinian struggle between the classes. You guys, the great unwashed down there, are lower class. If you die out because of tuberculosis, I mean, who cares? That's just a Darwinian struggle. Darwin said it's okay. Of course, he said never such a thing. But they are using a Darwinian argument in quotes, to justify their position. The Nazis came along and said, hey, there's a natural Darwinian struggle between the races. You Jews, you gypsies, you homosexuals, you lost, and we're Aryan, we won. So what's wrong? I mean, that's just Darwinism. Eugenicists say, hey, you're Sicilian, turn of the 20th century, therefore you're dark. I mean, yeah, maybe you're white, but you're darker. Maybe we need to sterilize you so that you don't procreate, or maybe we have to sterilize homosexuals so they don't. That's called eugenics. Hey, that's Darwinian. Well, none of these things had anything to do with Darwinian theory, but these Cretans, these miscreants, misused Darwinian theory to advance their goals. So a bunch of academics came along and said, how about we now, so here's consequentialism, how about we erect a new worldview where there is no such thing as biology, where biology should never be used to study human affairs, where humans are defined by the fact that they transcend their biology, because then we can protect against any future misuse of biological argumentation. And then hopefully, kumbaya, we could all sing John Lennon, Imagine. So basically what you built is over 100 years, you've built fields in anthropology and sociology, in the business school, in economics, in psychology, completely bereft of biology. So how could it be that out of 2 million species, 1,999,999, we would never presume to study them without referring to their biological heritage, but there's this one unique species called humans that somehow floats outside the purview of their biology. Now, that's how, by the way, I first got into this stuff, because when I was trying to Darwinize the business school, most of my colleagues were like, are you insane? What does economics or consumer behavior or organizational behavior have to do with biology? What are you, some kind of weird Nazi, Jewish Nazi professor? Well, that's how I said, my goodness, these people are parasitized. And eventually it went from that original debate within the strict confines of my scientific discipline, and then it was blown up into all of the culture wars that I'm now involved in.
Yeah, I mean, what I hear when you say that is that for these individuals, the ends of this utopian society justify the means and the behavior and the way that reality and truth is distorted, because it leads us to some sort of promised land that's going to be better for everybody else. It's delusion, essentially.
It exactly is that. And by the way, all of these ideological fascist movements have another commonality, exactly what you just said. There is a utopia out there. Before we came along, people, ate each other's children, right? So there's the pre-Islamic era of darkness, right? The ancient Greeks apparently gave us nothing of value. There was only darkness before Islam. Then Islam came. That's why within Islam, you do eradicate the markers of other cultures. That's why you do blow up the Buddhist statues in Afghanistan. That's not an anomaly. That's not false Islam. That's not Islamism. It's pure, simple Islam, okay? Because it is part of the existential definition of Islam to compare the pre-barbaric world and the pre-Islam, and then the utopian ideology comes along. Well, same thing with Marxism, same thing with socialism, same thing with wokeism. There's always a pre, and now we're going to come along, tabula rasa, bring down the statues. I mean, isn't it incredible that the Taliban brought down the Buddhist statues, and Let's bring down George Washington, that's racist slave owner. It's the exact same mechanism, right? In French, there's an expression, plus ça change, plus ça reste la même. Like the more it changes, the more it remains the same, right? So you might think that wokeism is very different than the Taliban. I mean, yes, they are. They wear different garb, but the underlying instinctual impulse is the exact same. We're here to create the final utopia.
How do you personally choose which battles you engage in? You're talking about the amount of research and information and data and all this the stuff that you're collecting. I mean, clearly you can't do that for every topic you could possibly have today. So like, how do you choose what's important to you to pursue? Because I think about that with myself. We're a men's movement. We're focused on men's issues, men in society. And so I personally trying to decide, how do I get informed and go deep into the subjects that are important, and how do I choose which ones to pursue?
Yeah, so for me, it kind of goes back to the two fundamental ideals that I discussed in chapter 1, truth and freedom. Anything that is a frontal attack on my ability to adjudicate truth is something that I'm going to weigh in on. That's why I'm a staunch defender of the scientific method, because there's never been anything as brilliant as the mechanisms by which we apply the scientific method to decide whether this hypothesis should be refuted or not. And anything that attacks freedom is something that I'm going to fight against, right? So now, that doesn't mean that I won't weigh in on specific issues, but generally speaking, if it's something that attacks truth with a capital T or attacks freedom, then I'm in. Now, it's exhausting because the onslaught of attacks on these two foundational ideals is relentless. It's nonstop. And so, you know, my blood pressure has gone up longitude. I mean, I'm being literally true. I've never checked my cortisol levels.
Cortisol, stress, sure.
Cortisol is got, you know, and so I try to modulate as best as I could. I try to institute mechanisms. I'm not going to check my social media on the weekend. I'm not going to check my emails on the weekend and so on. But generally speaking, it's very, very, you know, draining, because if you have the disposition to be someone who stands up and fights for truth, well, then you're going to be fighting all day long, because the attacks on truth are just relentless and endless.
You come to the conclusion in the book, you've got, and I appreciate this, because it might be easy to say, you know, so what, this is a lost cause and there's too much and the onslaught is everlasting. But you talk a lot about the solutions. And one of the things that you talk about is using the power of your voice. I'd like you to talk about that, because I think there are so many people who've bought into the notion that they just need to sit down, shut up, be quiet, and do what they're told. So I'd really like you to talk about that power of voice.
Sure. Thank you for that question, because it's a nice way to instill hope and optimism in people, right? Because, you know, if the book were simply, here are the collective maladies, good night, everyone, then it's not a very, right? It's kind of like you go see the physician and he or she tells you, here's what you have. Okay, so what do I do, doc? I don't know. Just
I don't need to go to a doc. I could have told you that. Like,
yeah, exactly.
I feel bad. I don't need you to tell me I feel bad and confirm that for me.
Exactly. Look, I discuss in chapter 8, the final chapter, different things that we can, different, you know, calls to action. One of which, of course, is, as you said, you know, use your voice. Now, many of these things to me seem trivially obvious, but apparently they're not, because I realized in being a fighter in the public arena for so many years that we need to amend the 7 deadly sins with an additional sin, and that's called cowardice, right? So it really is the case that, and I mean, you're a men's movement. I don't mean to imply that it is incumbent only on men to stand up, but one of the things that we think about when we talk about the heroic male archetype is someone who doesn't suffer from cowardice, right? It's someone who is courageous, someone who stands up to be counted. You know, the folks who landed on the beaches of Normandy. Well, what I've noticed in being a professor of almost 30 years is that most people are just grotesquely coward, right? So they would rather, as a default value, hide in the corner, sucking their thumb in a fetal position, and please, please, please don't notice me so I can go on with my life uninterrupted by any of this stuff, and let someone else. So that's another problem, diffusion of responsibility. Gad Saad is courageous for all of us. He'll handle it. Hey, thank you, professor. You're doing a great job. Please don't mention my name if you read my email. I don't want. Oh, right. So you're not even courageous enough to stand next to the one who is going to the guillotine, right? That's how cowardly you are. That's how castrated you are. That's how spineless you are. So use your voice simply means, and here, by the way, I don't mean to imply that everybody is going to take on the same levels of risks professionally or personally. I understand that there are individual differences in terms of how people want to navigate through the risk landscape. I concede that.
Or even the same risks. It's not, people reach out to me and say, well, Ryan, you should really, talk about this or do that. And my response is, you should do that. Like, do you think that's a problem? You should do that.
Exactly. And so what I tell people is, so how should you use your voice? And so here, I think the powerful imagery is that of a honey badger, right? And that's why I say activate your inner honey badger. I use the honey badger because for those of you who don't know, who are listening to the show or watching the show, honey badger is the size of a small dog. And yet it is so fierce, it is so ferocious that 6 adult lions, and I use the number 6 because there are clips where you see 6 adult lions being intimidated away from it. I just recently watched a clip of the honey badger that someone had sent me, where the honey badger was caught in the death grip of a python. And now when a python has you in that death grip, the chances of you getting out is literally statistically almost nil. Not only does the honey badger get out of the death grip of the python, when it now gets away from it, what do you think would be the instinct? It's right. We have the instinct of fight or flight. It's going to be flight. Run away. The honey badger said, now that I beat all odds and I just got out of your death grip, I'm going to kill you. And so it starts engaging the python, kills the python, starts carrying it to its, bushes. 2 jackals start attacking because they want to steal the python. It then attacks the jackals. So it escapes the death grip, kills the python, attacks the 2 jackals, and then it goes, who else wants a piece of me? Okay. So what does that mean? Well, walk through life like a honey badger. I don't mean that's a call to violence, but it does mean ideological fierceness, which it means when your professor says something that you think is insanely false, challenge them politely. Honey badger doesn't mean impolite. It doesn't mean cantankerous. It just means you stand your ground, right? If your friend on Facebook posts something that you think is objectionable, meet them at the pub and challenge them. So use your voice doesn't mean build a platform the size of Joe Rogan's. It simply means don't subcontract an opportunity to weigh in to others because you want to be free of anything that might come your way in terms of blowback. That's what then makes you a castrated coward. So use your voice, get engaged. Look, Christopher Rufo is a guy that had nothing to do with all this stuff with critical race theory. Through the serendipity of life, he gets some whistleblower stuff sent to him. 6, 8, 10 months later, look what this guy's done. There was no grand celestial plan for Christopher Rufo to have the influence that he has, garnered over the last year or so. But he's a honey badger. He said, I'm going to stand up. So we can each debate and modulate how much is enough for us. I'm not asking people to be reckless martyrs, but I'm asking them to rise up and speak out. And as I famously recently said on my appearance on Tucker Carlson, if the silent majority speaks out in unison, if we activate our honey badger in unison, we will get rid of these dreadful ideas by next Tuesday. If we don't, it will be a slow train ride to hell.
Well, I appreciate your willingness to do it because it certainly inspired me and it inspires other people. And that's another thing too, I think about it is that when you are willing to stand up and embrace that inner honey badger, like you're talking about, you also simultaneously give other people permission to do the exact same thing. And it's unfortunate, but the reality is that people are waiting for somebody to lead. So lead. Like you have an opportunity to do it and to influence other people. And I think we ought to take advantage of that opportunity and responsibility.
Agree. And lead, by the way, it doesn't have to be lead the entire nation, lead everybody online. It could be lead your family. It could be lead your group of friends. It could be serve as the leader in a classroom discussion, right? So again, I'm not suggesting that, you know, you have to be Winston Churchill giving the speech against the Nazis, right? Not everybody has that ability. Not everybody has that courage, but we can all do more than what we typically are comfortable doing. So rise to the occasion. I always tell people, because people ask me, well, what is it about you that causes you to do what you do? And I tell them, look, I have a very exacting code of personal conduct. This is actually kind of a good thing for a men's club to hear. Mm-hmm. Although, of course, it could apply to women as well. When I go to bed at night and put my head on the pillow, for me to not have insomnia, for me to sleep well, I need to know that I passed every junction, every fork of the road where I was called upon to do something and I did the right thing. If I don't do that, then I feel like I'm a fraud, I'm a coward. And that's something, there is no harsher critic of me than me. And therefore, my exacting code of conduct needs to ensure that I go to bed at night and say, look, I may not have solved all the world's problem, but I certainly didn't walk away from the pleas of help that truth was calling from the alley. I stood up. I posted a tweet. I attacked the bullshit keyboard warriors, the pronoun Taliban that 2 weeks ago, the luminary Einstein, Valerie Bertinelli, the child actress, came after me because I had shared a rather innocuous tweet where I was trying to demonstrate how kind and sweet my wife was, because she was having an interaction with a barista at a cafe and she didn't know exactly how to address the person because they seemed to be transgender. It was meant to demonstrate that she is very kind, that she's really thinking about how to do that. I mean, literally, that was the whole point of the tweet. 23 million tweet impressions later, literally that number, you know, where I've been called every single thing, death to you. They wish me every single possible death thing. Now, did I capitulate? Did I start crying? Did I issue an apology? Oh, no. The honey badger came back to kill the python. It only emboldened me. It only angered me. So foster that sense of indignation, right? It's not okay for your children to be taught how to twerk as 6-year-olds in class because it's progressive. It doesn't make you a transphobe if you don't want your child to see twerking in class. Be confident in that principle. And so that's what I mean by speak out and use your voice.
Well, I encourage everybody to pick up a copy of the book, and just want to encourage you, as if you needed it, to keep fighting the good fight, because you are leading people, you're leading me. And I really appreciate you taking some time to share some of your wisdom with us today.
Thank you, sir. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. I hope it wasn't too long-winded, each of my answers. I appreciate your gracious host style.
It wasn't at all. It was exactly what we needed to hear and what I wanted to hear, and some of the answers that I wanted to get. So thank you again.
Thank you, sir. Take care. Cheers.